Welcome to The Tax Factor, the top 20 business and investment podcast from Blick Rothenberg, the tax, accounting and business advisory firm. Election 24 with Ellie Theochari and Robert Salter.
Welcome to The Tax Factor, the top 20 business and investment podcast, which brings you all the latest news and updates in the world of tax and provides analysis of what it might mean for you or your business. I'm Ellie Theochari.
And I'm Robert Salter.
We're continuing our election coverage coming to you from our very own battle bus, which is making its way around Covent Garden and Holborn. The important subject of the week, did you have Sky as a child, Robert?
No, I didn't, but that might be a sign of my age as much as anything. Yes, I was definitely an adult before Sky came along. But yeah, I'm not sure it necessarily qualifies as a real hardship having Sky or not, though, despite Mr. Sunak's using that as an example. I think that's one of the more embarrassing bits of the election so far.
Absolutely. But I mean, speaking about the election and the various news from the parties over the last week, I mean, at the time of recording this, the Labour Party haven't yet announced their manifesto, so we can't necessarily speak about that, although we can next week once it's been announced. We can talk about the Tories, the Greens, Lib Dems and Reform, but we will also talk about some IR35, so some proper tax bits as well.
The Tax Factor, Election 24.
So in terms of the background to these manifestos, any comments should really be taken with a pinch of salt, and there is definitely some ongoing discussions within the parties about specific tax policies. For example, looking at the VAT on private school fees, and which is a Labour policy. We have previously discussed this, but it was interesting to see Emily Thornberry, who is the Labour Shadow Minister, admitting that it could easily result in extra pressure on the state schools and therefore loss for the Treasury, but also stress on public services. But saying that, we can look at the headlines from the manifestos this week from high-level perspectives. Robert, do you want to take us through what's been happening with the Lib Dems?
I think the Lib Dem manifesto kind of summarises a lot of the points you made with the Labour thing, and the fact that there's, I think, some disputes within the parties about what they really should be doing, how they should be doing it, what they really wish to achieve and things like that. There's certainly one or two things within the Lib Dem manifesto which, as tax advisors, we would absolutely support. They are looking at giving extra funding to HMRC, and anybody who has to deal with HMRC on a daily basis would 100% accept it needs additional funding. And that's not a criticism of the existing staff or something, but funding has been massively hit over 10 or 12 years. And the idea that artificial intelligence and bots and chatbots and everything can kind of be the answer to tax queries is just nonsense. So HMRC needs additional funding, and it needs to make sure that funding is used correctly and everything. But the fact that the Lib Dems are looking to spend, say, $1 billion extra on HMRC is potentially good news. Clearly, it's then how you spend it, how you make sure staff are properly trained, how you retain staff and things like that. But that is a good start. So that's one of those things I think hopefully everybody would say, yep, that's money well spent potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, kind of the spending for public services seems to be a big thing when you're looking at all of the policies across these manifestos. Where the magic money tree comes from, nobody knows at this stage, but certainly even across all the manifestos that we've seen, a pledge for extra public spending in HMRC, in the NHS, in schools, all of these state services seems to be sort of a kind of a big push given kind of the years of austerity and extra cuts to public services that have been over the last 14 years.
Yeah, and it's interesting then though when you say clearly I think most people would accept the public sector needs more money. Yes, it can become more efficient. Sometimes there's definitely waste, but fundamentally I think most people would accept at least part of the solution is making sure they have more money and the right amount of money. And with an ageing population, that's going to create extra pressure on the NHS. That's just a fact. And I'd like to think I'm 21, but I'm clearly not 21. I'm closer to retirement than anything else. But it's then interesting to look at some of the policies. Again, this is looking at the Lib Dems just as an example, where they talk about tax rises and potential tax rises, but they don't necessarily make sense in terms of really solving a problem or really creating any additional tax income for the government. Talked about share buybacks, for example, and potentially taxing share buybacks by companies. But that's so easy for companies to actually just get a loan. You pay dividends instead of share buyback. Most owners, investors in a company just want the money, typically. They're not going to worry too much if it's a dividend or a buyback. So having a tax on share buybacks, for whatever reason they think it should be there, isn't really going to bring you any money in. Again, they talk about $2 billion. Let's be honest, they're probably going to get a penny, really, if they introduce that. Similarly, they've talked about banning flights for distances of less than, say, 2.5 hours or time-wise of less than 2.5 hours where there's a rail alternative, etc. But then, actually, why ban them? Perhaps tax them. perhaps that would be a better solution so you get some money in and things like that. So I think on occasions there's a lack of full coherence, which is a bit disappointing given that we've had quite a few years to think about how the tax policy should be and things like that. Fundamentally, okay, the elections come a bit earlier than we expected, but everybody knew it was going to be coming in by, say, December at the very latest. So they've had time to kind of put things together better than perhaps have done.
Sure. And also when you're looking at the manifesto, some talk about it explicitly in the actual manifesto and some have, in terms of parties, have actually spoken about it when they're doing their debates or they're doing other kind of public speaking. There's so much talk around bringing in this extra money to pay for these services via either the tax gap or tax evasion. However, efforts previously, well, firstly, they haven't worked. I mean, the tax gap, for those who maybe haven't heard that before, is it's the difference between what HMRC actually bring in tax revenue versus what they think they should. And the delta, they believe, is predominantly from tax evasion, when actually, if anyone that works in tax will know that it's actually more likely because of just error. And when you get error across millions of people, that's how you're going to end up with that gap. How do you stop that? By having a properly funded, properly functioning HMRC that can kind of deal with all those queries, deal with those errors and stop those errors being made in the first place. But I suppose in any case, there used to be various teams within HMRC that would specifically look at tax evasion and look at schemes. So when schemes come to them or someone whistleblowers, for example, and says, I don't think this is right, then there would be a team to look into that. But that team was unfortunately cut, which means that HMRC is always on the back foot. And they're sort of 3-4 years behind, or maybe sometimes even decades behind, which means that by the time you get there, that money's lost.
Well, and again, when you look at the tax gap, a chunk of it is basically bad legislation, in terms of people aren't clear what it means, or there's two interpretations, or sometimes 4 or 5 different interpretations. And that isn't particularly good for anybody. Thinking about IR35, which is one of the things we mentioned at the start here, Adrian Chiles literally had his court case ruling from the upper tribunal this week, which has basically sent his case back to the first-tier tribunal to go through the whole rigmarole again as to whether is he really self-employed, is he really an employee. Now, that whole case has taken 8 or 9 years already and is basically a perfect example of how confusing the issue of employment versus self-employment actually is. From a labour law perspective, he's definitely self-employed. No issues about that whatsoever, but you can have a different angle for tax purposes. And then there's a lot of greyness. And this isn't Adrian Chiles having done anything dodgy or aggressive or anything like that. He's just taken a position, perfectly reasonable position, that he's self-employed. There's a lot of arguments to show he is self-employed. There's some other arguments which you're sure would say he's possibly an employee. But that, that's not, to my mind, a tax gap. That's bad legislation, a lack of definitive law, which makes it clear and easy for people to follow and say, yes, okay, I'm an employee, I'm self-employed, and therefore definitively do X or Y, whichever is required.
Even on this podcast, we've spoken about various IR35 and cases that have come out and some that have taken just decades to be resolved. And you just think also for the amounts in question, fine. For when you look at them, they're not insubstantial amounts. However, the amount of the taxpayers' money that is used to fight this over 9, 10, 11, 12 years, however many years, that could be so much better spent simplifying those rules or actually putting policy together that makes it, as you said, Robert, just so much clearer, which means that you don't have these cases that spend hundreds of thousands of pounds to maybe not even get that amount back.
Yes, I totally agree. And you see the newspapers say, in Mr. Chiles' case, that's 1.7 billion of tax in an ICG. Actually, the chances are it's nothing like 1.7 billion. Once you take into account the taxes he's already paid, for example, via these company and things like that, it may be a few 100,000. Okay, still a substantive amount, so potentially worth fighting. But it's not this meaty 1.7 billion figure they always come up with. Genuinely a lot less than that, because you get credit for the other taxes you paid. And at the end of the day, let's be honest, as a taxpayer, I don't care if somebody pays corporate tax, NIC, income tax, or whatever. Providing we get the tax we need as a country, that's all that matters to me. The label of the tax is irrelevant. And it is unfair that somebody has to fight it for so long. And even if he wins, and he's at least a 50% chance he will win, he will still be out of pocket at the end of the day because he will not get any money back from HMRC, even if HMRC have shown to act a bit OTT. Unless they act really, really badly, you'll never get your money back, which is, again, it's unfair.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we're moving sort of back to the manifestos, that the Reform Party would say we would get rid of it altogether. That would be something going forward. But I suppose they also have a whole other raft of policies they've put through. If you want to run us, they've got quite a lot of things about we're going to tax here, we're going to increase here. It's quite a lot going on with reform.
I have no problem with the idea of getting rid of IR35, so that's one I will definitely say a tick in the box. But some of the other ideas and the savings, etc., they come up with, I think, are slightly more pie in the sky or not necessarily kind of properly funded. But but they talk about saving 50 billion a year from the government. So that's basically 5% of all government expenditure. Where it comes from, how they get there, what the impact is on wider services, etc., isn't necessarily clear. But one or two other things, again, very popular amongst certain parts of the right wing. So increasing the IHT threshold to 2 million, for example, from the 325,000, it is, at least in some cases now, it can be more when you're a married couple, etc., and things like that. Some of that is certainly popular from a headline perspective, although I always take the view with IHT that it's a bit of a false tax. 90% or 95% of estates don't pay it at the end of the day. So it's only a very small percentage of estates that pay it. Clearly links to property sometimes in the southeast. Most people won't pay it. They won't pay that much if they pay it. My mum died last year. We'll pay a small bits at the end of the day, but it won't be a substantive sum. I think it's one of those which is, it gets a lot of press for given that it's not actually that much of an issue for 95% of the population. So I always find it a bit of a weird one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And on the kind of flip side, they also want to increase the threshold up to the basic rate threshold from, 12,750 up to 20,000. Now, that's great if they don't know where this then 50 billion of saving is coming from when they're also not collecting the tax. Where does this money come from? It's all well and good to say to people, yes, we're going to change the tax thresholds. We're going to lower the amount of tax that you pay. But ultimately, you can't then say, we are then going to increase this spending by more than we're bringing in, unless there is the kind of known outcome that there will be significant overspending.
Yeah. And so I think that's why, going back to what you said at the start, there's an element of cynicism legitimately about some of these manifestos. And I think it's healthy to take it with a pinch of salt. And, asking the questions like we're trying to ask, okay, well, what does it mean? What other things could be happening? What is the impact then of X or Y or Z? And, are we comfortable with X, Y, Z? Even within, say, the Reform Party one, they talk about reforming the NHS, making an insurance system. Well, at the end of the day, if I have to get insurance, that in effect is akin to a tax. Just because I'm not paying it as income tax, I'm paying it as a health insurance premium or something like that. Doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's still impacting my net income. So again, let's be honest about some of those things in terms of what it really means, what the costs could be. They haven't mentioned anything that I've seen in that area. So there's lots of quirks and hiccups and challenges. If they get those sorted out, then you can have better policy. But that's true of all the parties.
Absolutely. And then in terms of the Green Party, as we've not really touched on them yet, looking at their policies, other than the 50 billion seems to be such a number that's kind of running through a lot of these manifestos. So their promise was, to quote, to collect 50 billion from the very wealthiest. So yes, as you said, the 50 billion seems to be a bit of a finger in the air number. But when you kind of read their proposals, the core policies are sort of, you've got the wealth tax, equalising income tax and CGT, ending this alleged NIC loophole. I suppose, what do you think about those ones? Because a lot of them, it seems like they sound good on paper. And then when you actually lift the lid, you end up with much higher marginal tax rates once you actually start looking into how that would affect the average person.
Yes, absolutely. And on the wealth tax, I don't know how it will work in practice. All I can say is it doesn't seem to have worked in most cases around the world particularly well. There is one or two countries that have made it work. Switzerland has a wealth tax, for example, which everybody thinks of Switzerland as a low tax country, and it tends to be, but it has a wealth tax and it has made it work. They can work in principle, but like I say, more often than not, I think they failed. But then if you look at some of the things that they talk about, say, ending NIC avoidance and this NIC loophole, it's not a loophole. The reality is, it's just, if you got rid of what they practiced sort of thing, you'd end up with 40% taxpayers actually paying at 48%. You'd end up with 45% taxpayers paying at 53%. The reality is tax and NIC is in effect a merged tax. It's just because you've got different bands and different history doesn't mean it's not a merged tax. And they don't seem to recognise that. Whilst when you're looking at things like equalising income tax and CGT rates, well, when we've had equalised tax rates in the past, and we have had plenty of stages in the past at equalised tax and CGT rates, you've always then given inflation protection for CGT, for example. Whereas at the moment, we have basically 20% CGT. That's a kind of a default rate. There's different rates for certain other things, but you have no inflation protection. So the reality is, as things stand at the moment, lots of taxpayers are literally paying CGT purely on their inflationary gain. No real increase in value or anything like that, and they're paying CGT. Now, that's actually worked very well for the Treasury. It's actually very simple to administer. So again, from an HMRC perspective, they probably like it. If they really thought they're going to have 40% tax or 45% tax purely without any inflation protection, I think that would kind of go down like a lead balloon, realistically. And it wouldn't just be the wealthy paying that, because you have a small share option gain or sell a second home that you've got a share of who parents' property or something. You could easily have that sort of liability again. Yeah,
and NIC seems to be something that a lot of people are trying to touch on. All the parties are keen to do something with national insurance, and it has been tinkered with quite a lot even over the last few years, with the Conservatives now saying that what they want to do is remove NIC for the self-employed. The 2% surcharge, well, it appears right now that it would actually stay. But I think some people think that actually doing that is a little bit problematic. Why do you think that is?
I think from NIC only, specifically it's for the self-employed, or where they're looking to kind of reduce the NIC for the self-employed on the basis that those are the entrepreneurs and the wealth getters. Well, actually, in many cases, you're a Big Four partner, for example, or Magic Circle law firm partner. Are you really an entrepreneur, or are you just a very successful quasi-employee who just puts some money into the company and things like that? And they would probably be the biggest save. They're the ones who pay £2,500 national insurance each year, and that would be the maximum saving. So they would get it. Whereas a lot of small hobby businesses, for example, they may not get any saving, because if you're only turning over smaller amounts, the saving won't apply because you won't perhaps be paying NIC anyway. The other thing, obviously, is with NIC, unlike with tax, things like pensioners, for example, won't benefit because they don't pay it anyway. So there's always a slight question as to whether it's really an equitable tax, whether is it safer and better to cut income taxes if you were looking to cut things rather than national insurance. But it costs more to cut income tax just because it affects everybody, because all the dividend income, the interest income, etc.
Exactly. And it's just easier to cut something that, is fairly easy to get your hands on.
It's relatively cheap to cut in some ways, and it is, compared to income tax, it's a cheap cut.
Well, I think we've kind of covered most of the manifesto bits. As we said, we will cover Labour next week. It's some wider news. Just as a final point for something that's quite close to my heart, there is now the opportunity for professional advisors to report dodgy R&D advisors to HMRC using a specific email address, the purpose of which, pretty self-explanatory, is for you to be able to raise to HMRC if you see any unscrupulous advisors or you see any behaviours with specific R&D advisors that you think goes against kind of the ethical codes of HMRC or their qualifying body. You can whistleblow and you can report them. And at this time, we don't actually know what the outcome of that would be. There's not been a huge amount of guidance about what the next step is after that, once you've actually put in a complaint or put in a report. But hopefully it will be used advantageously.
And hopefully that's just the first step, and this will become wider and a more normal behaviour, because clearly as professional accountants and professional advisors, we don't need the cowboys. And to be quite honest, none of our clients need the cowboys, because it's the typical penny wise, pound foolish sort of thing in terms of if you use them, you'll be paying a lot more longer term.
Absolutely.
The Tax Factor, Election 24.
That's about all we have time for today. My thanks to Robert for joining me on this week's Tax Factor.
You can keep track of our election coverage and insights on our website, Blick Rothenberg /election24.
And if you've already had enough of the election, you can take a break from it by listening to our sister podcast, Brave Business, hosted by journalist and broadcaster Declan Curry. The series covers a huge range of topics, from launching a brand, expanding into the US, mental health, and each one features guest appearances from entrepreneurs who share their experience and advice. Next week, Robert is back with Rohanna Earl.
So it's goodbye from me until next week.
I'm Theochari. Thanks for listening and have a great weekend.
That's the Tax Factor. We'd like to thank you for making us one of the UK's top 20 podcasts. Find all our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts, and join us again next time on the Tax Factor.